So, welcome to session 5 of this series of talks about whether America is an imperialistic power. I think after today's lesson, at least on some occasions, the answer is definitely yes. And the war on terror is an example of how the United States decided to throw its weight around the rest of the world with a certain agenda. The war on terror has us thinking about radical Islamic terrorism, and that makes me wonder, well, why would the United States be a target of that kind of terrorism in the first place? Why would anybody be mad at us? And so I think we need some historical background, and I wanted to start with, because American support for Israel is such a central part of the picture, I want to start with the creation of Israel in 1947. Leading up to the Second World War, Great Britain administered Palestine as a mandate from the League of Nations. Mandate was a fancy euphemistic word for colony. The British controlled Palestine. But the cost of trying to maintain its empire after World War II became too much for Great Britain. They announced that they'd be pulling out of Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations approved a partition in which Israel, the Jewish population, would get about 55% of the territory, as it turned out, of the territory of Palestine. The map on the left on that slide is what is the border of Israel at the time of the partition. So at that point, it's the dark green area in the center of that part of the slide on the left, or the map on the left. In May 1948, as the British were leaving, the Jewish community announced the formation of the State of Israel. President Harry Truman recognized the State of Israel exactly 15 minutes later. He very much wanted to put a U.S. endorsement on the idea of an independent homeland for the Jewish people. There was the Arab nations were not at all on board with this idea, and the new Israel was attacked from multiple sides, managed to survive, and the armistice that ended that first war left the border pretty much where it is on that slide. Now, interesting, the United States was not a primary supporter of the State of Israel in the early years. During the 50s, for the most part, Israel got its weaponry from France and some other countries in Europe. The United States was somewhat keeping its distance because the United States also wanted to maintain good relations with the Arab countries in the Middle East to make sure that they didn't start getting too close to the Soviet Union. America got much more involved in supporting the State of Israel during the 1960s, and particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967. And it's in that war that Israel captured all the territory in the kind of light green on that slide. And where did my monitor go? There will be a brief pause for... Can we get our slide back? I really didn't do anything. Okay. I can talk for a few minutes while they're trying to figure this out, but we'll see what happens. It's back. Thank you all. Okay, so it was really after the Six-Day War in 1967 when Israel conquered the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights up near Syria. At that point, the United States policy became making sure that the Israelis always had military superiority. And so during the 1970s, the United States was supplying Israel with $1 to $2 billion of military aid every year. One consequence of the increase in American aid to Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1973 was the Arabs declared an embargo on oil to try to pressure us into not helping Israel. You may all remember those pictures of lines at gas stations. The Arabs tried to use their leverage. The United States, this is sort of quite a figure. The United States was using 16 million barrels of oil every day. And 40% of the oil we were using was imported, much of it from the Mideast. The Arab countries thought they would have enough leverage. The retail gas prices went up about 50%. There were shortages. The embargo lasted for 6 months, and the Arabs finally let go of it and decided to start selling the oil to the West again. American involvement in the Middle East took an encouraging turn, you could certainly say, under Jimmy Carter. This is, that photo is probably the highlight of his presidency. He brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin together at Camp David outside of Washington for 12 days of intense negotiations. And they were in different cabins, and Carter's running back and forth, bringing messages from each one. And at the end of the 12 days, it was a pretty impressive deal. They worked out a framework for the return of the Sinai to Egypt, for the establishment of some form of self-government for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Egypt actually recognized the state of Israel as a legitimate government. It was a big breakthrough at the time. It was also very controversial within the Arab world. And in just a few years later, radical Islamists in the Egyptian army assassinated Sadat as part of their protest at the idea of improving relations with Israel. If that's the highlight of Carter's presidency, the Iranian hostage crisis is certainly the low point that helped drive him from office. So let's quickly talk about that. Thanks to U.S. support, the Shah of Iran ruled that country with an iron fist for 25 years, from that CIA coup I mentioned last time in '54 all the way up to the late '70s. But pressure for democratic reforms in Iran grew in the late '70s. There were liberal politicians who wanted an actual legislature that could make decisions. There were labor unions that wanted recognition. And there was a Islamist student movement, all of them pressuring the Shah, all of them taking to the streets. And as the CIA, in its infinite wisdom, assured Carter there was no chance of a coup, no chance of the Shah being overthrown. And that's, as it turned out, the pressure grew, and the Shah did leave the country in January of 1979. The next month, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the spiritual leader of the Islamist movement in Iran, he comes back from exile, and within just a couple of months, he and his followers take over the government. It's a very popular movement, huge crowds in the streets. And so by the middle of 1979, Iran has a religiously based government with Khomeini as the leader. The United States tried to have relations with that country, and who knows what might have happened, except that the Shah of Iran, the ex-Shah, had cancer. He asked for permission to come to the United States to go to the Mayo Clinic for treatment. Carter thought that was the civilized thing to do for someone who had been an ally of the United States for so many years. So he gave his okay, and Khomeini and the student movement in Iran was outraged. They wanted the Shah returned to Iran for trial. And as a protest, Iranian students invaded the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, seized 66 people. They soon released the women and the African Americans in the group, and they held on to the 52 white men that they had captured and kept them as hostages. America, Nightline. This is when Nightline began. A few days after the embassy was seized, ABC started having nightly broadcasts with Ted Koppel, Nightline, and keeping score. America held hostage day, whatever. Beside Nightline keeping score like that, another public symbol of how focused Americans were on the hostages was the yellow ribbon phenomenon, if you remember that. It was a popular song that was adapted for this purpose, to show that Americans had not forgotten the people who were held hostage. Carter tried all sorts of things diplomacy, freezing Iranian assets, tried all sorts of things. Nothing worked to get the hostages back. He then authorized the military to try to fly in and rescue them. That was a disaster. They landed planes and helicopters in the Iranian desert with the thought of trying to find the location where the hostages were being kept. The American planes and helicopters crashed in the desert. 8 Americans were killed. It was a complete fiasco. The inability to get the hostages back really, for many Americans, symbolized Carter's ineffectiveness as a president. You know, to me, some of that was unfair. Like, what was he supposed to do? We could have invaded Iran to get the hostages back, but they probably would have been dead by the time we got there, and that might have been going too far for the world public opinion. In any event, Carter was helpless, and it was one of the main reasons that Ronald Reagan won the election. To add insult to injury, minutes after Reagan was sworn in, that's when the Iranian students released the hostages. So it all happened the same day, covered on the New York Times there. And Reagan, who was quite polite about it, authorized Carter to go to Germany to welcome them when they got off the plane, because Carter had tried so hard to get them back. Now, one of the unexpected consequences of the Iranian hostage crisis was we started supporting that guy, Saddam Hussein. Now, why would we do that? Well, this gets into the bitter division within the Islamic world between Sunnis and Shiites. And I don't pretend to be any sort of an expert, but there has been a division within the Islamic community ever since Muhammad's death in 632 about who should be in charge. And you have the Sunnis believe that Islam should be governed by elected caliphs. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The Shiites believe the caliphs should be chosen from descendants of the Prophet Muhammad himself. So it's a disagreement about how to govern the religion, and Muslims have been killing each other about that ever since, which, we could sort of laugh, except, in the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics happily killed each other for disagreeing about how the Christian religion should be organized. It's not a phenomenon unheard of in Christianity as well. So why did it matter? Khomeini and his supporters were Shiites. Most of the countries in the Middle East are governed by Sunnis. Hussein and his follower, or his henchmen in Iraq were Sunnis, but over half the population of Iraq are Shiites. So Hussein was concerned that Iran would stir up trouble in Iraq, and to sort of try to prevent that, Hussein attacked Iran in 1980. They ended up fighting each other. Iran and Iraq fought a war for the next 8 years. And throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration provided Hussein with $5 billion of economic aid, military helicopters, intelligence from spy satellites. We even supplied Hussein with the pathogens to make anthrax for biological warfare. And they knew that Hussein had been using chemical weapons on his own people, on the Kurdish element. Nevertheless, you've got Reagan having getting together with the Iraqi foreign minister there on the left of that slide, and you've got Donald Rumsfeld visiting Iraq and shaking hands with Hussein there on the lower right. Henry Kissinger said about the Iran-Iraq war, "It's a pity they can't both lose." But American priorities were different. If you were an enemy of Iran, as Hussein was, then you're somebody we're going to support. Also, curiously, during the 1980s, the United States supported radical Islamic terrorist types in Afghanistan because they were fighting the Soviet Union. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to try to protect a pro-Marxist government there. Muslims across the Mideast flocked to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Saudi Arabia funded the Afghan resistance to the tune of about $500 million a year. And the United States provided these radical Islamist folks in Afghanistan with $3 billion of aid during the 1980s. Now, Islamic terrorism became front-page news partly because of Afghanistan, but also because of further developments in the Mideast. And here we go. In June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to eliminate bases that the PLO was using for its attacks. You got to say, what is it, 40-some years later, and Israel is still invading Lebanon to take care of attacks from the anti-Israeli forces. It's some things apparently don't really change. So Israel invades Lebanon in 1982. The United Nations organizes a intervention, a peacekeeping force. Ronald Reagan committed 800 Marines to that joint peacekeeping force. They were supposed to be a buffer. There were 30,000 Israeli troops in Lebanon, 15,000 Syrian troops in Lebanon, and a whole lot of Lebanese militias who all hated each other. So the US troops were supposed to be a buffer and try to keep the peace, and instead they became a target. And in October 1983, a terrorist truck bomb blew up at the Marine headquarters near outside Beirut, killed 241 American Marines. As a response, Reagan moved the Marines offshore, put them on a US naval ship, and a few months later he brought them home. They never really were able to accomplish anything. I'm not sure they ever could have. And that stage of the Lebanese civil war lasted until the 1990s. Now, a year later, Islamic terrorists, members of Hezbollah, which is a group based in Lebanon and Syria, hijacked a TWA plane that was headed to Beirut. They killed an American Marine. They released most of the passengers, but they kept 3 Americans as hostages, demanding the release of Muslim fighters that Israel had captured in Lebanon. Reagan very much wanted to bring the hostages home, so he and his team devised a way to try to, what became known as arms for hostages. This is one of the lowlights of the Reagan administration. So the guy in the upper left there, that is the National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane. He came up with this plan. The theory was Hezbollah, which was based in Syria, was getting a lot of its weapons and support from Iran. McFarlane believed there were moderate elements in Iran that you could reason with, and if we sort of bribed them, they would pressure Hezbollah to release the hostages. So his plan was, well, how about if we have Israel sell weapons to Iran? They can sell Iran old weapons. We'll then give Israel new weapons, so they benefit. And if Israel sells these anti-tank missiles to Iran, they will kindly pressure the Hezbollah to release the hostages. The Secretary of State, George Shultz, Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, both thought it was a crazy idea and objected. Reagan overruled them and authorized it. It didn't work too well as a plan. Israel did sell missiles to Iran. Hezbollah did release a couple of hostages, but realizing it had a good thing going, it captured more hostages, right? I mean, you're like in the market now, you're selling hostages. And then Colonel Oliver North, down the bottom of the slide, who was a military aide to the National Security Council, he proposed, well, why don't we just drop Israel and we'll sell the weapons to Iran directly? Now, there was a problem with that because the United States had a policy against selling weapons to countries that sponsor terrorism, and Iran was certainly one of them. Nevertheless, Reagan and his team went ahead. They used a CIA front organization to sell missiles to Iran. 2 hostages were released and 6 more were taken. And this is going to lead a little bit to a tangent, but I have to do it briefly. North was just getting started. If you might remember, this is also the period where Reagan wants to fund the opposition to the Marxists in Nicaragua, those folks known as the Contras. Congress said no, that Congress didn't want any American money being used to support the Contras. So North came up with this bright idea, well, we're making money selling weapons to Iran, why don't we shift some of that money to Nicaragua and fund the Contras with it? That violated a host of laws. And it all came crashing down when a CIA plane delivering weapons to the Contras got shot down in Nicaragua, and the pilot confessed that he worked for the CIA. Suddenly, the idea that we were not only trying to bribe Iran to get hostages back, but funneling some of the money to the Contras led to the big scandal at the end of the Reagan administration, known as Iran-Contra. At first, Reagan denied that there'd never been an arms for hostages deal, and then his advisors had to sit him down, show him his signature on a few things, and remind him that, yes, in fact, he had approved it. So he went on TV and admitted that it turned out it was true. Reagan's approval went from 67% to 46% in 1 month, which is the sharpest drop to date. But remarkably, nobody went to jail on this one. I'll just go back for a second. North looked really good in that uniform, right? So he goes to Congress and testifies in his Marine uniform, and he basically says, sure, not only did I break the law getting money to the Contras, I shredded documents. And I had to do it because you guys in Congress weren't protecting American interests. So I was forced to break the law. He was a big national celebrity, if you all remember. Ali Mania, the press called it. At the end of the day, nobody went to jail. A few people got convicted, but the convictions were overturned. George H.W. Bush pardoned a few other people. The Democrats had hoped Iran-Contra would turn into another Watergate, but it didn't work out that way. Now, the next big event in today's story comes a few years later when Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990. If you look at the map, you can see that Kuwait is a tiny little country on the southeast corner of Iraq. And Hussein claimed that, in fact, historically, Kuwait had always been part of Iraq, and the only reason it wasn't is that at some point the British, when it was a colony, drew a line to separate them. But he claimed that Kuwait was really part of his country, and so he wanted to, bring it into the fold. At the time, Iraq produced 11% of the world's oil. Kuwait produced 9%. And if you look at the map there, and it's not labeled too well on that version as I look at it now, but the gray blob directly to the south of Iraq is Saudi Arabia, which at the time produced nearly 20% of the world's oil. So there was a great fear among American leaders that after he's incorporated Kuwait, he's going to look down and decide to incorporate Saudi Arabia as well. George H.W. Bush immediately sent 500,000 American troops and a lot of planes to protect Saudi Arabia. And then he did a truly masterful job of building an international coalition with the goal of driving Iraq out of Kuwait. He lined up about 40 other countries to contribute men and or money. They're all in the blue on that map. So from countries around the world. At the end of 1990, the United Nations authorized the use of force if Iraq didn't pull out. So did Congress. And where are you? Tell me my battery just died. My battery did just die. Anybody have two AAA batteries? There will be a brief pause. Beth, help. We're winging it today, apparently. Let's see. Oh, it went forward. Oh, there it goes. All right, who knows, Beth? It was just asleep. We'll see what happens. Thank you for trying. Okay, so in early 1991, Operation Desert Storm began with a months-long aerial bombardment of Iraq. Planes flew 100,000 missions and dropped nearly 100,000 tons of bombs. And then the ground assault, and very, very quickly, the United States pushed the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. There were only 150 American soldiers killed, maybe about 25,000 Iraqi soldiers killed. Bush's approval rating reached 89%, which I think is still the highest in the history of Gallup polling. But there's two really important points about the Gulf War, beside the fact that it went really well and Bush was very popular for a period of time. One is that the United States made no effort to get rid of Hussein himself. There was no mandate from the United Nations to go on to Baghdad and get rid of that government. There was no mandate from Congress to do that. None of George H.W. Bush's advisors recommended getting rid of Hussein. And in fact, Dick Cheney, remember him? Dick Cheney was the defense secretary at the time, and he told a reporter, like, to defend the fact that they hadn't gone any further. So, once we round up Hussein and get rid of his government, the question is, what do you put in its place? You would have accepted responsibility for governing Iraq. Well, at the time Cheney was saying that, the idea of accepting responsibility for governing Iraq sounded like a crazy thing to do. 10 years later, Cheney thinks it's a wonderful thing to do, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. So one important point of the Gulf War is we left Hussein where he was. Nobody decided it was time to get rid of him. The other is that even though before the actual attack on the Iraqi forces, Bush and the King of Saudi Arabia pledged that after the war was over, the U.S. troops would go home. They would leave Saudi Arabia and go home. However, after the war was successful, Bush left 5,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia, mostly at air bases that were being used to monitor Iraq's compliance with some of the sanctions. 5,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia may not seem like much, but American troops that close to the holy places of Islam, which are in Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina, those American troops in Saudi Arabia were a huge source of anger in the Muslim community in many parts of the Middle East. So this brings us to Osama bin Laden. So let's talk about him for a minute. He had a very privileged childhood. There are his parents in the upper left on the slide. His father operated the largest civil engineering and construction company in Saudi Arabia. His father was really wealthy, and Osama was really wealthy. As a kid, he was exposed to a lot of Western influences. Apparently, his favorite television show was Bonanza. Go figure. That family photo there, that's all the bin Laden children visiting Sweden on a family trip. And the person circled in red, that is a young Osama who seems to be having a good time. He looks pretty happy there. Bin Laden built a reputation in the Islamic world in the 1980s by helping to funnel money to the Afghan resistance in Afghanistan. The resistance to the Soviet Union. And the organization that he helped to found, Al-Qaeda, built training camps for Islamist fighters in Afghanistan. The training camps had 3 official goals. This is what they were teaching the folks who came there. The 3 goals were to establish the rule of God on earth, 2, to attain martyrdom in the cause of God, and 3, to purify the ranks of Islam from the elements of depravity. So this is purify Islam as a religion and also purify the Middle East and build the regime, the rule of God on earth. These training camps gave a mission and a sense of purpose to a lot of disaffected young Arabs. Many, people came, and that map is sort of, it's hard to read from where we're all sitting, but people flocked from other Muslim countries to Afghanistan to be trained in those camps, and partly to fight the Soviets, and then also to be ready to carry the message elsewhere. In February 1993, an Islamic terrorist exploded a bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. So there was a first World Trade Center bombing, you might remember. In the basement, 6 people were killed, 1,000 people were injured, $500 million of damage. The FBI said it was the largest bomb they had ever seen. A few years later, another bomb goes off at the housing complex in Saudi Arabia where the American troops are being kept. 19 American soldiers were killed, 500 people were injured. Hezbollah claimed credit for this one. Bin Laden is getting a bit of world press because of his vocal support for the cause in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And in 1997, Peter Arnett, representing CNN, went and interviewed bin Laden in a remote location in Afghanistan. And it's interesting. Here's a quote from one of the things bin Laden said in the interview. "The United States today has set a double standard, calling whoever goes against its injustice a terrorist. It wants to occupy our countries, steal our resources," translation, oil, "impose on us agents to rule us, and wants us to agree to all of these things. And if we refuse to do so, it says to us, you are terrorists." The next year, bin Laden announces an Islamic jihad. I don't know if you pronounce the J in that word, if you really know Arabic. I apologize. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But bin Laden issued a call to Muslims everywhere to wage war on Americans. He said the killing of Americans and their allies is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. What are the reasons he gave? He gave two: American occupation of Saudi Arabia and American support for Israel. And he said that those two policies of the United States constituted a war on God and his messengers and a war on all Muslims. Now, up until this point, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had gotten some press coverage, but they hadn't, as far as we know, hadn't yet started blowing things up. But that was about to change. In August 1998, al-Qaeda suicide bombers attacked 2 U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa. The bomb in Kenya killed more than 200 people, including 12 Americans. The bomb in Tanzania killed 11 people and wounded another 100. All of the victims in Tanzania were Africans. But investigation soon uncovered the link to al-Qaeda. The FBI, there's some discouraging insights into how the American intelligence community worked that come up in this story today. The FBI learned that a member of al-Qaeda walked into the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and warned them about the plot to blow up the embassy, and the CIA dismissed the warning as unreliable. Now, I know they get a lot of things reported to them, but that's sort of sad to think about. So what was the U.S. response to this bombing? The United States fired 60 cruise missiles at an al-Qaeda sanctuary in Afghanistan. As retaliation, the missiles killed more than 20 people, but missed bin Laden. American missiles also struck a factory in the Sudan that was suspected of making chemical weapons. It turned out the factory in Sudan actually made half of the country's medicines. It's just, you never know what your intelligence is telling you is accurate. When Clinton authorized those missiles fired at al-Qaeda sanctuaries, this was the middle of Monica Lewinsky and the impeachment saga, and Republicans in Congress blamed Clinton for overreacting and trying to distract people from what was really important, which was Monica Lewinsky. Now, 2 years later, an al-Qaeda suicide bomber attacked a U.S. destroyer, the USS Cole, in a port in Yemen, blew a 40 by 40 foot hole in the ship, killed 17 sailors. Clinton authorized the CIA and the FBI to capture bin Laden if at all possible. The FBI put him on its 10 most wanted list. But interestingly, despite these bombings I've just mentioned, if you go back and look at the transcripts, terrorism played no part really in the 2000 election. George W. Bush and Al Gore didn't talk about it. It wasn't something people were focused on yet. George W. Bush wins the election, and in the summer of 2001, the director of the CIA, George Tenet, told National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice that al-Qaeda was planning a spectacular attack within a few weeks or months. The next month, in August, the head of counterterrorism, Richard Clarke, delivered a briefing to Bush entitled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike at U.S." And reported that members of al-Qaeda had been traveling to the U.S. for years, that there was a pattern of suspicious activity consistent with preparations for hijackings. And Bush, after getting the briefing from Clarke, Bush said to him, "Okay, you've covered your ass now." Now, that sounds awful, and there has been obviously a lot of finger pointing after these warnings came to light. But the reality is they didn't give Bush anything specific to work with. They didn't ask him to do anything. They didn't suggest if we only went after these people, we might be able to prevent the spectacular attack. They kind of warned him and left him hanging. And so with hindsight, this stuff sounds terrible. But on another level, you can sort of sympathize with somebody like Bush, so they tell me this stuff, but what do they want me to do about it? And at the time, they didn't give him anything he should be doing about it. On September 10th, 2001, Bush approved a CIA proposal for a plan to somehow undermine al-Qaeda, and then he got on a plane for Florida to promote his No Child Left Behind program. The next day, so I've got some videos to show you, but I'm also just struck by, it's been 25 years, right? This September, it'll be 25 years. It's somehow, on some level, that seems like a long time, and on some level, it seems real fresh. So this is the first news coverage that I believe anybody had. Let's see. Let's see if I can get it to work. All right, we'll go back, we'll go forward. Come on now, Beth.
Jim, just a few moments ago, something believed to be a plane crashed into the south tower of the World Trade Center. I just saw flames inside. You can see the smoke coming out of the tower. We have no idea what it was. It was a tremendous boom.
That's the very first news flash. I then found on the internet some guys were filming some construction project on a high little road repair project somewhere in South Manhattan, and this. Another home movie. It's amazing how many home movies surfaced after this. So people are watching the first tower. And then, about an hour later,
the North Tower came crashing down.
Heard a rumble. I thought it was some more jets coming in, and I looked up, and the North Tower was starting to collapse. Turned around, ran as far north as I could.
So, you remember I was working in downtown Boston, and they let us out early, of course. And I remember walking from center of town up to North Station. You're surrounded by office buildings, right? And I just remember looking up, thinking, holy, that was really strange. That was really scary. So 2,600 people were killed at the two towers, including more than 400 emergency workers. The wreckage burned for 100 days. At the same time, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, killed 190 people, died on the plane and in the building. There was a fourth plane. Passengers speaking to relatives on cell phones, learned what was going on already, and stormed the cockpit, caused the plane to crash in a field in Pennsylvania. So a total of more than 2,800 Americans were killed on 9/11, which was more than on D-Day. Congress created a committee to investigate. The commission report is really quite interesting. I won't actually read it all once. And that book is the best book I've encountered as a chronology of the events leading up to and the investigation of 9/11. So, the books sadly document all sorts of failures of American intelligence. For one thing, there just weren't many people at the CIA or the FBI who could speak Arabic. It makes it hard to figure out what they're doing if you don't understand what they're saying. The FBI and the CIA agents hated each other and refused to share information with each other. The CIA obtained a laptop with an Al-Qaeda organizational charts on it, rosters of radicals in Europe. The CIA discovered that a couple of the people who piloted those planes were already in the U.S. with U.S. visas. The CIA didn't tell the FBI what they knew. On the other hand, the FBI had warnings from some of its field offices that there were some suspicious Arabs attending flight schools in the United States, and the field office warnings were ignored at headquarters. Now, the U.S. government and the media immediately compared 9/11 to Pearl Harbor, the concept being, the nation itself is under attack. Americans are at war. That night, George W. Bush went on television to declare that he was going to wage a war on terror. Here's an excerpt from his speech.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Now, the FBI and the CIA quickly determined that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were responsible for the attacks. The CIA determined that bin Laden was hiding in Tora Bora, a remote region of Pakistan a region of Afghanistan just next to the Pakistani border. At that time, Afghanistan was governed by the Taliban, a strictly religious Islamic regime. Bin Laden was helping to finance the Taliban in exchange for protection. The Taliban refused Bush's request that they turn over bin Laden, and Congress authorized the use of force. In October 2001, American planes began bombing Taliban locations. Bush accepted U.S. military advice to let the Afghan resistance, the people within Afghanistan who opposed the Taliban, mainly known as the Northern Alliance, Bush's advisors said, let the Northern Alliance do most of the fighting, but American planes helped out with a good bit of air power. The Northern Alliance did drive the Taliban out of Kabul in the middle of November 2001. They didn't try really hard, and they didn't succeed in capturing bin Laden, who escaped across the border into Pakistan. The United States tried to keep order over the course of the next year or so. The Afghan government was not exactly very stable. But in May 2003, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld declared victory. He said, Bush and General Tommy Franks and the president of Afghanistan have concluded that we are at the point where we have moved from major combat activity to a period of stabilization and reconstruction. That was a fantasy. There was fighting within the Afghan, there were several factions in Afghanistan who hated each other, and the fighting continued, and then the Taliban mounted a comeback with aid from Pakistan. So American soldiers remained in Afghanistan for years. President Obama pledged that all U.S. troops would leave by 2010. But before he could do that, the military asked him for a surge, one last attempt to really try to root out the Taliban and restore a pro-Western government. So you can see the surge of American troop levels after Obama became president. That didn't really work. The first Trump administration reached a deal pledging full withdrawal by 2021. The last American troops left Afghanistan in August of 2021. American troops had been in Afghanistan longer than we were in Vietnam, 20 years. And it took 20 years, but the Taliban were back in charge. Ultimately, the Taliban outlasted the American intervention. Fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan created an interesting problem. What do you do with the people that you capture? People who might be terrorists. Bush authorized military commissions to try the terrorists, and come back here again. In January of 2002, Bush authorized the military to open a special prison at Guantanamo Bay on Cuba. They picked Guantanamo because it was clearly under American military control, but it wasn't technically American soil, and so in theory, the Constitution wouldn't apply. And not only didn't the Constitution apply, but Bush signed an executive order in February 2002 that the Geneva Convention didn't apply either. As far as I know, the United States has the dubious distinction of being the first country to specifically authorize its personnel to violate the Geneva Conventions in the treatment of prisoners. There were lots of prisoners. Rumsfeld claimed that the detainees at Guantanamo were, quote, among the most dangerous, best trained, and vicious killers on the face of the earth. Actually, one study, a reliable study, determined that only 8% of the prisoners had any connection to al-Qaeda. More than half of them weren't even alleged to have fought the Americans in Afghanistan. And most of them had actually been captured by bounty hunters. We have created a market for suspected terrorists, and people were kidnapping folks and turning them in as terrorists and getting the bounties for it. Obama ordered Guantanamo closed within 1 year after he took over. Congress refused to close it. Trump and his first administration vowed to keep Guantanamo open forever. As far as I checked this morning, Guantanamo is still open and has 15 prisoners. They've been there for as much as 25 years. Several of them have never been charged with a crime. Beside Guantanamo, the CIA also developed what was known as a rendition program of capturing suspected terrorists and then flying them to secret prisons in other countries like Poland and Romania. Those are all, the countries in red on that map are all countries that helped out with secret prisons. The ones in black are the ones with the secret prisons. One CIA agent said, this is with respect to Poland and Romania, we told them that we would help them join NATO if they would help us torture people. Direct quote. And torture is not an exaggeration. In June of 2004, a memo was leaked to the press. It was written by Jay Bybee and John Yoo at the Justice Department in 2002. The memo argued that the CIA and the military could use, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques without violating the UN Convention on Torture. So what did they do? Prisoners were locked in tiny cells. They were kept hooded, stripped, deprived of sleep, threatened with attack dogs. They played incredibly loud music at them hours at a time. They punched them, they slammed them against walls, and they waterboarded them. And I don't know, I tried to imagine being waterboarded once. It is a terrifying thought. If they're just pouring, they did have a doctor on hand for all of that, just in case. So I guess that makes it good. But according to Bybee and Yoo, it is not torture unless you inflict serious physical injury, which they defined as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or death. And it's not torture unless it lasts for months or even years. And this is the best one. It's not torture unless your only goal is to inflict pain. And since the goal was to extract information about terrorism, by definition, nothing they did was torture because they had pure motives. When the memos were a disgrace to the legal profession, when the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility found out about the memos, it concluded that they amounted to professional misconduct. It recommended that Bybee and Yu be disciplined. The recommendation was overruled, and instead Bush rewarded Bybee by making him a federal judge. And Yu went back to teaching law at Berkeley, one of the nation's best law schools, and he's still there as a distinguished professor. They didn't pay a price for what they supported. The United Nations Human Rights Commission denounced our interrogation techniques as torture. They called on the U.S. to close Guantanamo. The European Union accused the United States of violating internationally accepted standards. Canada put the United States on its official list of rogue nations that use torture. Bush and his advisors didn't care. Now, beside Afghanistan and the consequences of Afghanistan, when how to deal with all those prisoners, from the very beginning, Bush and his advisors turned their sights on Iraq. So here you remember these folks, but you've got Vice President Dick Cheney in the upper right, you've got Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. From the very beginning, they started thinking about going after Hussein. In fact, on the afternoon of September 11th, so it's just happened, they're meeting about what to do about it, and Rumsfeld says, well, as long as we're going to go after bin Laden, why don't we go after Hussein too? Bush asked the counterterrorism people to look for any evidence that Hussein was involved in the attacks. The CIA told him absolutely not. Hussein had no role. There's no connection between Iraq and 9/11. That's actually one of the things the CIA got right. There wasn't any connection. Nevertheless, Bush asked Rumsfeld to develop a plan for invading Iraq. Now, why the obsession with Iraq? There are a number of reasons. One was personal. After the Gulf War, Hussein authorized agents to try to infiltrate the United States and assassinate President George H.W. Bush. So Hussein had made efforts to try to assassinate George W.'s father, and George W. was outraged. There was a national defense reason. They did believe that Hussein had chemical and biological weapons and planned to use them. Despite the lack of evidence on 9/11, they did believe that Hussein was supporting al-Qaeda. But the bigger one, and the one that really gets into, they believed that they could overthrow Hussein and install a popularly elected government in Iraq that would spread democracy throughout the Middle East. Bush told a meeting of Republican governors, I'm going to make a prediction, write this down. Afghanistan and Iraq will lead that part of the world to democracy. They are going to be the catalyst to change the Middle East and the world. That's pretty arrogant. That's pretty naive. I was going to say stupid. I don't know if that's fair, but the idea that we could bring democracy to the Middle East with American firepower, that's pretty imperialistic. That's pretty much, we're going to tell the rest of the world how to behave. Beside that kind of supreme confidence that we can actually change, America is so powerful it can change the world. Remember, the Cold War is over. We are the superpower on the planet. Why can't we do that? There was also a more cynical dimension to it. Defeating the Taliban wasn't enough, wasn't perceived as a big enough response to 9/11. This is amazing. One of Bush's senior advisors said, the only reason we went into Iraq is that we were looking for somebody else's ass to kick. Afghanistan was too easy. Bush delivers, in his State of the Union address in 2002, Bush delivered a speech in which he denounced North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as an axis of evil, threatening the peace of the world. At that time, more than 70% of Americans thought Hussein supported al-Qaeda and was involved in 9/11, even though it wasn't true, and more than 70% of Americans wanted us to invade Iraq. The military planning continued during the year 2002, At one point, Bush asked George Tenet at the CIA how the Iraqis would react to a U.S. invasion, and Tenet said, the Iraqi people will rejoice. They will welcome us as liberators. Bush and his people spent a lot of 2002 trying to scare the American people into getting on board. Cheney told a convention of the VFW, simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. Time is not on our side. The risk of inaction is far greater than the risk of action. But no doubt that Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. There was no intelligence telling him that. There were little glimpses of things here and there. Condoleezza Rice said on a new show that it was unclear how fast Hussein could get nuclear weapons, quote, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. And then in October 2002, the CIA submitted one of their formal intelligence estimates. And it said, without qualification, Baghdad has chemical and biological weapons. It said Iraq is reconstituting its nuclear weapons program. And if it can get enough uranium, it could make a nuclear weapon within a few months. All the analysts' internal doubts in the early drafts of that report were edited out. They fashioned a report that they knew the bosses wanted to hear. Cheney and Bush, particularly Cheney, who was like if you read enough about this, Cheney was the driving force behind building the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But that report was, it sounds like the CIA is saying, yeah, he's got all these terrible things. And that was one of the main reasons that Democrats lined up in support. And in October 2002, Congress approved the use of force by a large margin in both the House and the Senate. Among the Democrats who voted in favor of using force were Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton. And it would be risky to go against public opinion when the president is telling us that the free world, the Middle East, and perhaps the world itself is endangered by a guy who's got his finger on nuclear weapons and has all, chemical weapons and all that stuff. It takes a lot of courage to say, no, I think you guys haven't made your case. So leading Democrats went along with it. Iraq issued a very long report denying that it had any weapons of mass destruction. Bush went to George Tenet at the CIA and said, are you sure? And Tenet said to him, the case for weapons of mass destruction was, quote, a slam dunk. UN inspectors didn't find anything, but at that point it didn't matter. In February, Bush and his advisors sent Secretary of State Colin Powell to the Security Council to make the case. Powell was maybe just about the most respected public figure in the country at the time. George Tenet of the CIA vouched for all the information they gave Powell. Powell went to the UN and, with satellite photos and all kinds of stuff, argued the case. Almost everything that they gave Powell to say turned out not to be true, but Powell believed them. He trusted what he was told. The UN wasn't sure about it. Bush decided he wasn't going to wait any longer. On March 19th, 2003, the attack began. It was a four-fold attack. You had two lines of American troops heading up on either side of the Tigris River. You had British troops heading east to the oil fields, and you had the 101st Airborne landing in northern Iraq. The war did not last long. Within about exactly a month, U.S. troops entered Baghdad. It was the end of Hussein's regime. Hussein himself went into hiding. And so on May 1st, Bush addresses military and invited guests on the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. And here's the famous clip.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country.
Yeah, so we're engaged in securing and reconstructing Iraq. At the point when he spoke, only 138 American soldiers had been killed. It really was a cakewalk at the beginning. Mission accomplished, right? The big banner over his head, mission accomplished. But things were about to go terribly wrong. Come on now. They have gone terribly wrong. I can't get my, come on. No, oh no. Okay, can we get that back? I don't think I did that. I don't think I can do that. Well, that's really interesting. So I don't think I can make that happen. I'm not sure what just went wrong. But in any event, all I had on the next slide is a picture of Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld. So you can just imagine them. Colin Powell had warned George W. Bush before they invaded, if you break it...
My fellow American.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. There they are. Thank you all. Powell had warned Bush, if you break it, you're going to own it. It isn't the getting to Baghdad, it's what happens after you get to Baghdad. And it's not going to be easy. But Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld seriously underestimated how hard it would be to keep order in Iraq. They assumed they could do it with a lot fewer American troops than the military leaders wanted. They assumed that ordinary Iraqis would welcome the Americans as liberators. They assumed that they could continue to sell Iraq's oil and the money from selling the oil would pay for the occupation. They assumed all sorts of things that didn't turn out to be true. Rumsfeld appointed Paul Bremer to run the provisional government in Iraq. There he is in that lower part of the slide. He was an expert on counterterrorism who had once worked for Henry Kissinger. It seems to me that Bremer does not look very happy. Maybe it's just that photo. Maybe he knows what's about to happen. In any event, Bremer makes two huge practical, as it turns out, practical mistakes. First, maybe, there we are. He issued an order that barred basically everybody who had belonged to Saddam Hussein's political party. All the senior members of that party, he barred them from serving in the government of Iraq going forward. Now, the problem with that was in order to be in the civil service in Iraq, you had to be a member of Hussein's party. So by barring everybody who had been in that political party, the Ba'ath Party, Bremer excluded the 75,000 people in Iraq who actually knew how to run the country. The result was chaos on the ground. American troops couldn't keep order. American troops couldn't keep the phone systems running. American troops couldn't keep the electricity running or the sewage plants running. There weren't enough Americans to keep order. Looting all over the country, including, sadly, the Museum of Antiquities, which had a fabulous collection of materials that disappeared onto the black market. The US troops couldn't prevent looting of weapons depots of the Iraqi army. The US troops because US troops believed there were weapons of mass destruction, they were afraid to go on to the Iraqi military bases for fear there'd be things like poison gas there. There wasn't, but because the Americans kept away, the weapons on those bases also disappeared. The chaos got ordinary Iraqis blaming America for what had happened, even if they were happy to get rid of a guy who was indeed a terrible dictator. Day-to-day wise, there's chaos on the streets. And then Bremer follows it up a week later with an order that abolishes the Iraqi army, the Iraqi police, and the Iraqi security forces. Basically, anybody who had helped keep order in the old Iraq was now out of a job. That was 650,000 Iraqis, many of whom still had their weapons. And now they're out of a job and they're angry. There's a power vacuum in Iraq at this point. The forces that had once held the Iraqi system together have broken down. You've got Iraqis hating each other, the Sunnis and the Shiites, ethnic rivalries, the Kurds, and many Iraqis start venting their frustration against the Americans. What became known as the insurgency, daily attacks on American troops. In July 2003, Bush told the reporters, There are some people who feel that the conditions are such that they can attack us there. Well, my answer is bring it on. We've got the force necessary to deal with the security situation. Now, that kind of, hey, no problem, bring it on, was like an invitation. And there were many Iraqis who accepted that invitation. Within a few years, there were maybe 75,000 Iraqis actively fighting in the insurgency. Within a few years, there were hundreds of attacks every single day. The weapon of choice was the improvised explosive device. There was so much American ammunition floating around that anybody practically could get their hands on the materials to make a bomb that you could bury in the highway and have a truck drive over and explode. And you got to wonder how the American soldiers were supposed to defend themselves against that. In December, American Special Forces raided a farm in northern Iraq and actually found Hussein, who was hiding. He was tried by a special Iraqi tribunal and executed for having murdered hundreds of Iraqi civilians. Bush's and advisors thought that by getting rid of Hussein, things would calm down, but instead the insurgency got worse. And in fact, things did get much worse for Bush in 2004. One part of the problem was the Abu Ghraib prison. This was a notorious prison under Hussein. I mean, he kept all sorts of people there and did terrible things to them. The U.S. troops decided to use it to hold on to people that they had arrested. Whenever U.S. troops went into a dangerous region, they had this habit of rounding up all the young men and locking them up so they wouldn't cause trouble. Pretty soon, Abu Ghraib had 10,000 prisoners in it. It was designed for maybe 1,000. The U.S. military estimated that 90% of the people in the prison had no intelligence value whatsoever. But once you'd rounded them up and locked them up in a place like that, they were afraid to release them, because if they weren't angry before, they were going to be angry now. So they just kept them there. 10,000 prisoners behind bars at Abu Ghraib. And then in April 2004, CBS News starts broadcasting these photos of the abuse that was going on in the prison. American contractors were abusing, beating, humiliating. I mean, I'm sorry for how graphic a few of those photos are. The photos even show, on the lower right there, that's an American guard celebrating over the dead body of someone who has been beaten to death in American custody. That's it. It was obviously this was a disgrace, and the news was broadcast all over the Arab world, and maybe we'll get there. Yeah. The news coverage, it scandalized, it outraged Arabs all over the Middle East, and many of America's allies were equally outraged. There's the British journal, The Economist, urging Rumsfeld to resign. And at the same time this was happening, the justifications for the war itself fall apart. The 9/11 Commission report is issued, and it proves that there was no connection between Iraq and 9/11. Then the survey investigation, once they invaded Iraq, they went looking for all those terrible weapons of mass destruction. The report concluded there weren't any at all. The U.S. sanctions against Iraq during the 1990s had worked really well. They never did get their chemical weapons and biological weapons programs up and running again. They never did get their nuclear weapons program up and running again. So there weren't any WMD, as it turned out. And in fact, this wasn't made public at the time, but the CIA determined that Iraq was now the world's leading training ground for Islamic terrorists. So, I mean, yeah, we got rid of Hussein, but we turned out to create a perfect laboratory school for training people to hate Americans and to spread terrorism. After Obama was elected, he was able to bring American troops down within a couple of years. Troop levels were reduced to 5,000 in around 2012. Apparently, there are still a few thousand Americans there acting as advisors. One final, and we are getting close to the end, I promise. One final episode in the war on terror took place under Obama. In 2011, American intelligence services managed to track down where bin Laden was, where he was in Pakistan. He was inside a walled compound in a kind of obscure rural section of Pakistan. They sent in the commandos. This commando raid actually worked. You have the photo there is the team in the White House watching these minute-by-minute updates. You've got Vice President Biden, President Obama, Secretary of State Clinton watching, and the raid worked. Bin Laden was killed during the attack. They buried him at sea because there wasn't any country that would accept his remains. Hollywood made a movie of it, Zero Dark 30, which I don't know if anybody's seen it, but that was a really good movie, I thought. It was really fascinating documenting the years that it took to try to figure out where bin Laden actually was. Okay, so what did fighting the war on terror do for us? I tried to add up some costs, and it's always hard to measure some of these things. I mean, we know the American troops lost about 7,000 killed, 50,000 wounded. Nearly 2 million US military personnel were deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan at some point during the years I've been talking about. 7,000 were killed in combat, but there have been over 30,000 suicides, which is statistically a ridiculous percentage. The trauma from that, I mean, I don't know. There were military fighting on both sides, pro-US forces, anti-US forces, about 250,000 soldiers killed on both sides. And again, these estimates are tough, but it's estimated 150,000 civilians killed. And if you want to think in terms of money, it's estimated the US government has spent or will spend $8 trillion on this. And the future expenses are mainly the care of all those veterans. So, as a final slide, mission accomplished. All right, I mean, on one level, you could say that the war on terror is over. It took 20 years, but the US is not engaged in active combat any longer. The enhanced security, you know, the stuff we go through at airports, the Patriot Act, the various things that law enforcement added to its arsenal, they have managed, there hasn't been another 9/11 on American soil. So, but those are sort of small good things. But on another level, for all of our great power, we could not establish a stable pro-US government in Afghanistan, and now they've got the Taliban back. And we could not, most definitely, build a stable democracy in Iraq. It's just, building a democracy is way harder than Bush and his advisors thought it would be. And you need a political culture that's committed to the rule of law, to free elections, all sorts of things. It takes practice to have a democracy, years of practice. And the idea you could impose it by the force of a gun and it would work right away was nonsense. And Iraq still doesn't really have a stable government, as far as I can tell. All right, so mission accomplished. I don't think so, but in any event, you can each decide for yourselves, because what I think doesn't matter. All right, so we are going to have one more class next Monday at 1:30, not 2, 1:30, and we're going to talk about Donald Trump. And yes, we are. We're going to be brave, right? And one of the things I want to try to do, I mean, beside just sort of reminding us all what he's been up to, is to sort of emphasize some of the things that he's been doing are things America has done in the past. And some of the things he's doing, we have a tradition of doing. There are other things that he's doing that are pretty much unprecedented. And I'm going to sort of try to use that framework, like putting some things in perspective and highlighting how some other things are just like, whoa, where did that come from? In any event, we'll try to do that next week and see what happens. But thank you all for coming. And thank you again to Bert and to Beth for working in the, thank you all.